here's the interesting thing. So my background obviously came from more of the larger utilities, larger infrastructure type projects. But as I was talking to the panel over the past week, one thing that and this is on me, was that when I thought of infrastructure, my mind automatically went to railway, roadways, your airports, your large infrastructure projects, because those are typically top of mind. But very seldom did my mind ever really go to stormwater. And believe it or not, stormwater is one of those things that we could not be doing the projects that we're doing without a stormwater prevention plan. It is extremely important, not only for looking at new low-impact development techniques for future projects, but also resiliency programs on existing infrastructure. So with that, I would like for our panelists to take a couple minutes to introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump into the panelist questions. And please, we may have some time. If there's any questions, you may be able to ask them. So with that, I want to turn it over to Liz.
Hi, so my name is Elizabeth Steinstraw. I am currently a landscape and stormwater manager for Metro Nashville, and the department I work in is General Services, and the division that I'm on is the Sustainability Division. A little bit about me: I previously was in oil and gas as an environmental coordinator and EHS manager, and then after that I worked with Metro Water Services as a stormwater inspector for about 5 years.
Hi, my name is Tyler Carpenter. I'm a research manager with the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. We call it TASER for short. And I've been with TASER for 10 years, and we do a number of things, but the primary purpose of TASER is to do public policy research. And for the last 2 years, I have been in charge of the Public Infrastructure Needs Inventory project for the state. And so I work with development districts to collect infrastructure data and produce a report each year to advise the legislature.
My name's Brian Keller. I'm Director of Environmental Management and Engineering for Fayette County, Georgia. We have many hats in that department, including stormwater, environmental permitting, transportation projects, streetlights, solid waste. I've been doing environmental permitting and regulations for about 20-something years now. Started on the private side, moved over around 2008 to Fayette County.
All right, well, you mentioned permitting there, Brian, so I'm going to go to you for the first question here. So, with my background being in project management, we all realize that we have to mitigate and manage risks, and risks can come in all shapes and sizes. Could you please walk us through or kick us off by sharing what Fayette County is doing to assess risks associated with stormwater infrastructure, permitting, specifically maybe around the Army Corps of Engineers?
Yeah, when we talk about mitigating the risk for stormwater projects, my biggest one is the Army Corps. They're part of the 404, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want fines. So we make sure that we follow those rules and regulations. Now, each region is a little different. They each have regional conditions, but we all follow the nationwide permits. There's about 59 nationwide permits that you can get underneath the Clean Water Act for dredging or putting fill material. For stormwater, we focus mainly on 2 or 3 of them. We focus on nationwide permit number 3 and nationwide permit number 43. Our risk is if we do it wrong, yes, we can get caught and there will be fines associated with that. What we've done to minimize that is one of the requirements is that you need to embed the culvert a certain depth. It's usually around 20% for us in the perennial streams. That allows for aquatic life to get through the culvert. And you can only disturb up to 100 linear feet permanently of that stream. And so without having to pay fees for stream bank mitigation or wetland credits of over 1/10 of an acre. So what we've done is it cost us more, but we've actually shortened culvert lengths, added guardrail in order so that we could keep those lengths under 100. Now, one risk that we didn't know on one of our projects was a project that started back in 2006. We were going to build a road and it was going to have a bridge so the stormwater would go through it. Well, we knew there was a mitigation bank that we were going to have to cross. Well, that mitigation bank is owned by Georgia Department of Transportation. And we are now in 2024, And we still do not have an answer if we can cross that mitigation bank in order to build the road. This road was to be a bypass to go around the city of Fayetteville in order to move traffic more efficiently through the county. And right now, it is still with the Army Corps of Engineers, our environmental attorney, and the state trying to figure out if we're even going to be doing it. Now, that being said, this is happening all over the state of Georgia right now in about 4 or 5 different instances because land is premium. And back 20, 30 years ago, when they were doing mitigation banks, they actually allowed for GDOT or other entities to buy wetlands and protect them through covenants. Now it's primarily done through mitigation banks, which are away from these type of areas.
Maybe just to follow up on that, you mentioned the Army Corps project where you couldn't access the land. How has that project, I'm assuming the project is no longer funded, or is it funded, or how, because we know that funding we can lose if we're not going to execute the project. Where's that stand?
Well, that's funny. It was a 2004 SPLOST project. SPLOST is a special local option sales tax that's special to the state of Georgia. The voters vote on capital improvement projects, and then they're funded that way. So there is money set aside for it, but recently our Board of Commissioners have decided to eliminate almost all the funding for the road except for the bridge. So if we ever do get through the mitigation bank, they'll have to find another way to fund that project.
All right, very good. Yeah, I had a similar situation back in the day. I was doing a big transmission project, and we had about 45 miles of 345 kV transmission, and we didn't put a mitigation plan in place for the Indiana BAT. Now, I mentioned to you guys that I'm from the area, and here in Tennessee, please don't judge me for this. Bats were target practice. I'd never had even thought that a bat would be a critical habitat, but in the state of Missouri and Illinois, we had to put bat boxes in place. So nonetheless, we had to actually put extra funds, extra duration in our schedule, and it actually caused us to delay the project by roughly 2.5 to 3 weeks. So it's extremely important when you're thinking about these critical habitat and permits that you have a mitigation plan early on. All right, next question is going to be to you, Elizabeth. So, Elizabeth, when I think about Nashville and the massive amount of construction that's actually going on, I have to believe that your office is quite busy. So could you please walk us through what stormwater infrastructure is general services responsible for?
So fortunately, my office is not busy. That would be our development services. They are our engineers, the ones reviewing those plans. But general services is responsible for quite a lot of particular infrastructure considered stormwater control measures, which are post-construction stormwater controls that are regulatory requirements to treat the first 1 inch of any stormwater that falls onto the facilities that we own and or lease. And so with that, we have a very small but mighty responsibility to maintain these structures. So when these structures are not maintained, they do cause extra localized flooding that we already receive. And anyone who's from Nashville knows that in 2010, flooding was a huge issue and kind of put flooding issues and matters like that to the forefront of everyone's mind. And so that kind of allowed Metro Water Services, which is the department that regulates those structures, to implement a program to kind of start to inspect those structures and also present the private sector with their inspection reports as well. I was one of the first 2 inspectors hired on for that program, and we built that program out in about 3 years, I think. And so now every citizen is inspected, or I guess not citizen, but every stormwater construction or stormwater infrastructure owner is inspected and gets a report every 5 years.
Very good. Now, are most of those projects that you're doing, are they typically classified as maintenance, O&M, or capitalization, or both?
They can be both.
Okay.
So it just depends on the project, but I typically work with just operational management of the inspection and maintenance, and then also our capital projects, they can incorporate that, but that's typically separate funding that I fortunately do not have to manage.
Very good. All right, thank you. So, Tyler, I'm going to come to you next. You bring a very unique perspective to this panel. By overseeing the public infrastructure needs database for Tennessee. I'd like to hear more about the challenges that you see governments are facing with stormwater infrastructure. Specifically, can you talk about the prioritization and funding of capital projects to harden those systems and how that has changed over the last decade?
Thank you for that question. Before I get started, I want to mention that I had the privilege of working on a project that was specific to community resilience and flooding more specifically. And as we all know, that flooding is one of the costliest, actually it is the costliest disaster that we experience, causing flash floods, inland and riverine flooding, infrastructure failures, and so on. Some of the challenges that we found in that report and that I see with local governments are infrastructure that's built for historic precipitation. And we're seeing more and more increased rain events and more volume of rain in shorter amounts of time, which lead to flash floods. And so I think that the challenges that local governments are facing are updating their systems, keeping up with that, but also we're starting to see more and more governments put money towards planning. And some local governments don't even have plans to address stormwater from a holistic perspective. When we look at the 10-year needs that are in the inventory for stormwater, I identified an interesting thing after we talked in our pre-meeting. The needs that are reported by local governments for stormwater have actually been decreasing in the last 10 years. They've decreased by 32% from 203 million to 137 million. And the estimated cost of completed projects have also been decreasing. And I can't give you a solid answer for why that is, but my assumption is perhaps because they're starting to be proactive. Some of these projects are making them more resilient and therefore likely have fewer fixes that need to happen in the future. I also want to mention that for the prioritization and funding, grants go a long way to move projects forward. And we see a lot of projects in the inventory that are able to be completed because of grants, whether it's the American Rescue Plan or other grants. Stormwater fees are also a popular funding method, and federal loan and grant programs tend to support planning and practice implementation, and so that kind of decides the prioritization as well. So there's a lot of different influences that come together. And lastly, I'll say that ultimately it's the elected bodies that decide what projects get funded. And so it depends on who sits on those boards and what their prerogative is.
All right.
Piggyback really quick on his funding. He was talking about stormwater fees. In the state of Georgia, actually, my father started the first stormwater utility in the state of Georgia in the city of Griffin back in 1996, 97. Very successful. They have a very proactive program. I came along. I've actually followed in his steps quite a bit. I'm now in public works and utilities. And I started one in the city, or for Fayette County back in 2013, which was probably the third or fourth that got abolished 3 years later. We didn't do the education that's needed in order to let people know. Like you said, people don't think about stormwater. And so what you need to do is to educate the people about that. Well, we had 4 town halls that lasted around 4.5 hours apiece. At the end of those, the Board of Commissioners came up with the SPLOST idea. If they were to do a special local option sales tax, they would abolish the stormwater utility fee. Well, the SPLOST passed and the utility fee went away. The problem with SPLOST is for capital projects only. It doesn't cover maintenance. And so that's one thing that we have to do is still fund all our maintenance and smaller projects out of the general fund.
So I know when I came from the public utility side, there were some very creative ways that we could take O&M and convert to capital if we were doing replacement. Are there any of those things that are going on within stormwater?
In the state of Georgia, for SPLOST specifically, no. All that has to be capital only, except for repaving of roads, which is considered a maintenance item.
Okay, very good. All right, well, thanks. So Brian, I'm going to stay with you because the next question I do have for you is going to be more around the surrounding community. So when you think about you and your surrounding communities addressing water quality, quantity, low impact development, and green infrastructure, could you also comment on the funding? Oh, I got to do this, I guess, on the funding side. of what you were doing for Fayette County.
Yeah, so for low impact development, back in 2006 or 7, I wrote probably one of the first low impact development manuals for the state of Georgia for the city of Griffin. I was working on the private side for them. We relied heavily on the Chesapeake Bay area because they were scrutinized for the amount of pollutants that were going in there, and so they were one of the first to do low impact development in the United States. So through that, we created that manual, and then from that, the Georgia Stormwater Management Manual, which was produced in 2001, has been updated since then to include a lot of low impact development stuff. But over time, that's also changed. We're part of the Metropolitan North Georgia Water Planning District, which requires that we collect the first inch runoff and do what's called runoff reduction. This is the low impact development that we're talking about. That means you collect the water on site and you actually infiltrate it back into the ground. This is something that's becoming more prevalent across the United States. Georgia's probably the third, fourth state in the North Metro that's requiring this. It's becoming very difficult, though, in unincorporated Fayette County because we are septic only. And so these stormwater management facilities are actually fighting for this room for septic. So we don't have a lot of commercial that can come in and put both a septic and do infiltration into the ground. There are some outs for that. If you don't have the room because it's fighting for septic, you actually can waive the requirement in order for them to do that. But the problem with low impact development on my side is the long-term maintenance and inspection program. We do have a maintenance agreement that goes with the parcel itself. So when a subdivision comes and develops, they form an HOA, we have a stormwater pond or a low impact development stuff. All of that has to be inspected on an annual basis. That is submitted to us for review. We have to go out and do an individual inspection also. My one inspector. And so what happens though, my thoughts are in 25 years when these HOAs go defunct or they're no longer needed, we're going to end up with a bunch of property, and we've already had this happen, that ends up on the courthouse steps because nobody wants to buy a detention pond or pay the taxes on it. Well, then I have to go back to the actual property owner that picked it up off the courthouse steps and tell him he's got to maintain a detention pond or I have to take him to court. And so unfortunately, I see a lot of that coming. I don't really have a good solution for it, but I do think that's going to be an issue in some of our subdivisions in the future.
Interestingly enough, so where I live, we see a lot of those new homes coming up that are close to the roadways, and they're building those retention ponds, and I could see that being a problem in this area if there's not a plan in place as well. So Elizabeth, I saw you shaking your head. You want to add to anything he just said?
Oh, I have so much I could add to what he said. However, I will stick to same. We have the same issues with parcel owners being owned by someone in California who has no clue what they've just purchased, but they wanted to purchase in Nashville, and so they bought this bulk parcel, package, and it happened to be one of those. And so we have that a lot here. I actually, when I worked at Metro Water Services, was the enforcer. So I was the one calling the property owner saying, oh, hey, by the way, you have this stormwater feature on your parcel and you've got to spend $20,000 now. And so it's not fun. It's not a great conversation, but I think that also speaks to the education piece that's still missing, right? That people just don't understand the gravity of what stormwater means for them and their community. And so I feel like a lot of us, specifically in the Southeast, have that where stormwater has been considered, but usually it's just move it away from the foundation and move on. And so I think now that we're trying to integrate this LID manual, which we also have, but we're also trying to implement these green infrastructure practices, it's a completely different train of thought when it comes to stormwater, and it's a train of thought that not everybody in the community has just yet.
I would say if I bought a house in the Nashville area and I was told I had to pay $20,000, I wouldn't be too happy either, right? All right, so Elizabeth, we're going to come back or stay with you. We've talked a lot about the other types of infrastructure, whether it be railways, roadways, airports, and we all understand that it's extremely important to maintain because they're all aging. Could you please walk us through what your Office of General Services for Metro Nashville is doing to make our stormwater infrastructure more resilient?
So the first step was funding, right? So I took this position, I think 3 years ago. Before me, they didn't have a stormwater manager at all on staff, and I think that the position was vacant for about 3 years for the landscape manager. And so really I hold two manager positions. They should really be separated, but because stormwater was so new and because nobody really knew how to navigate the implementation of a stormwater manager for this department, I kind of just like piggybacked and I was like, yeah, sure, I can pick up landscaping, I don't mind. But for me, what that meant is I had to leverage the stormwater need, right? So I had to provide justification for why stormwater was important, why we were required to maintain these stormwater features. So I had to create a justification letter and present it to council. Well, luckily I didn't have to present it, our director did, but we have 40 council members on our council. So yeah, 40 with the 4. So educating all of them and kind of explaining to all of them the implications of this non-maintenance work was a lot. A lot of them probably had never even heard of stormwater in this capacity. And so that was a really big challenge. There were a lot of questions back and forth. I probably spent a few weeks just answering their questions. Why haven't we been doing this? What is the implications if we don't? And so that was a really big, I guess, hurdle in my opinion, because it seemed to me like they would already know, but I also came from a water background, so maybe not. So that was a really big challenge. And then once we did have the funding, it was kind of like the chicken or the egg, right? So we have this money, but now I don't have anyone who knows what they're doing to maintain things. So of our portfolio of vendors, we had one construction company that kind of knew what stormwater was because they would install them, right? A construction company installs them. But the maintenance part of it, they had never done. They usually install and walk away. So it was really an education piece for them as well, and we're still educating them. So I requested this funding, I think 2 years ago. I got it last year. And then this was the very first year. So our physical year ends June 30th. So this was the first physical year where we had actually performed maintenance on these structures. Wow. And so we're still really learning what that landscape looks like for us.
Brian, I saw your eyes open up whenever she said 40 councilmen. How many do you have over there in Fayette County?
5.
So a little bit less. What about do you have a resiliency program within Fayette County?
Not really. We're part of an MPDS, a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, which is nationwide. And those are for communities that are in urban areas with X amount of population, 50,000 people. As part of that, we are required to adopt these ordinances. And so in that way, yes, we do have that. So we have to trap the first inch of runoff. Where it's really coming into play for us is on our transportation projects. Anytime you add over 5,000 square feet in the state of Georgia of impervious surfaces, roads, sidewalks, things along those lines, you have to look at doing detention, retention, water quality, runoff reduction, and things along those lines. So now each one of our transportation projects starting in 2017, we have to look at that, which means acquiring more land, having maintenance on those things, and making sure that we're protecting the downstream property owner.
All right. I think we have time for one last question. I want to give it to you, Tyler. So Tyler, I'd like to take a few minutes. A few minutes ago we did discuss about funding. So in your studies, which projects are receiving the greatest attention in combating stormwater, and why do you think that is?
Again, good question. So our inventory contains both unfunded conceptual projects and funded projects. I say that because anything that the city or county considers a need will make it into the inventory. But it's the funded projects that move forward, obviously. And so the projects receiving the most attention as reported to us are actually our drainage improvements, work on culverts, and home buyouts is a big one. Elizabeth said earlier, there's this mentality of move it away and move on. I think that is definitely still something that is being done, and in many cases it's probably a good thing. There's some trends that I identified, and I believe that, again, as I mentioned earlier, grants have a lot to do with shaping the way that some of these projects are developed. The American Rescue Plan, I was able to identify that majority of the projects that they have funded have been comprehensive projects that include multiple improvements, and also citywide assessments. The city of Jackson was awarded a $10 million grant to produce a citywide assessment and master plan. Needs are also driven by commercial and residential development, as we have talked about impervious surfaces. The water's got to go somewhere. And there were a handful of projects in 2023 that were actually completed. There was a levee pump, home buyouts, and culvert fixes in Davidson, Sumner, and Lake counties. And I also wanted to add that this may seem like common sense, but the majority of the projects that we have in our inventory for stormwater are located in close distance to major rivers. And so when you look at a map, the projects they tend to be clustered around Nashville, Chattanooga, and Memphis, which makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got 4 minutes left. I do have one question. I want to direct it over to you, Elizabeth. Because the Nashville area is it's exploding.
Yes.
It seems like in many cases, it's across the board, but here in Nashville, it just seems so much more prevalent than other areas. Do you find that, is it hard to keep up with the growth, maintaining the stormwater plan versus, how are you keeping up with that?
Yes, I mean, it is a challenge. I think at its peak, which was probably right before COVID hit, so I want to say 2019, we had in our queue at Development Services probably 70 to 80 plans to be reviewed monthly. So every month we were getting 70 to 80 new development plans. And this was anywhere from a single family residential to a commercial skyrise. I mean, it was crazy. We also have a website. It's a crane watch of Nashville, right? You can go on it. We would go on it and we would say, okay, how many cranes do you think are up today? And we would kind of just take a guess. So expansive growth for our county, but also that means a lot more pressure on the existing infrastructure and a lot more pressure on the citizens who are currently here because they already feel overwhelmed by the growth, right? I mean, you turn around and the hillside that was there is not, and there's an entire building. And so I think one of our directors actually was trying to take our new director to a location, and he was like, oh, I know the way, and he was just driving, and he was like, every landmark I've ever remembered is gone. He was like, he said I had to pull GPS out because we are just growing so much. And so for these stormwater control measures that are permanent and that are regulatory pieces that treat that 1 inch, I think Davidson County alone has about 7,000 of those structures. Only 500 of those are Metro owned. So the rest of those are privately owned structures that directly implicate our MS4 and PDS permit, which to me, I don't really love those numbers. I don't love that the private sector has that much ability over our permit, but that's the reality of where we are.
You know, it's funny you mentioned the landmarks. I shared in the earlier panel that I moved up to St. Louis right after college, was there for about 15 years. I came back, and I would come back every so often, but anyway, it was probably around that 2007 to 2010. I just started noticing a lot of construction going on in the Providence area where, well, actually it was creating Providence is what it was doing, because I grew up in Lebanon. And what's interesting is just the amount of growth. If you just travel from here to Mount Juliet, it is solid. And then it's becoming the same from literally Mount Juliet to Lebanon. When I grew up, Mount Juliet was a country town. It's not that way anymore. It's just it's crazy to see the growth. I just want to see this. We're done, but the last thing I want to ask: how many in here were very familiar with stormwater prevention plans? So a handful, some. Hopefully you've learned a little bit today, and if you want to learn more, we've got some expert panelists here that would love to sit here and talk to you about it. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ken, and he's going to usher in our next speaker.